Hi, this is KimiKSP, and today I have the delightful opportunity to introduce you to David Vincenti. Not only is David a fellow project management professional who's invested a huge amount of his time and energy in moving the profession forward, but we share something else. David likes to refer to himself as a poet and project manager. And while I don't write poetry, we both share an interest and a long history in the performing arts. And I think that that's informed some of how we approach leadership from a definitely more holistic perspective, maybe than some of our colleagues. In performing arts, we often see that leadership has to be fluid and it goes from person to person according to the situation. So, what I'd like to do right now is to offer you the chance to get to meet David as well. David, I need to hold. So, David, as someone who's invested so much of his time and energy in leadership issues, also connecting to the project management professionals that we both spend a great deal of time working with. So, David, we all learn lessons in life, and I'd like to know what lesson in leadership you have gotten. And obviously, being holistic thinkers about the subject, this can come from anywhere, but mostly from experience that you feel just wouldn't have been the same if you tried to gain that lesson through a book or a podcast or even, God forbid, professional speakers that we are, from a presentation.
Mm-hmm. That's a great question. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of the stories today. We read often that leadership is captured in the small moments of interaction with our teams, with our organizations. But there's a story that I tell about my days in college theater that makes that point, that leadership is in the small moments, more evident to me than any other experience could be. And it goes like this: we were producing the play Harvey. And in the show Harvey, there's a character that I portrayed in our college production named Dr. Sanderson, who is just an arrogant, rotten human being for most of the show. And I tried to stay in character. So backstage, I was always being very stern and walking around and staying in character. And at one point during a scene transition, I heard our stage manager call out my character's name, and that was unusual. And I turned around and he was struggling with flying a backdrop. And flying a backdrop just means counterweight, so that a backdrop on the stage would go up into the rafters so that the next scene could continue. He was struggling with it. So he just called my character's name and he pointed. I ran over to where he pointed and I held something while he secured it. Then, of course, we were in the middle of a production, so we couldn't stop and talk about it. Show went on. Show was fine. Shortly after the final curtain came down, the stage manager, who I referred to as Uncle Ted for most of my career for everything I learned from him, came over to me with 2 bottles of beer, which of course is the currency of the college mail. And he opened one and put it in my hand. He opened the other one, held it out, just clinked my bottle and walked away. And I realized in that moment that he had asked for my help. I had helped him in that moment, and he was providing me recognition in a visible and meaningful way for what I had done for him. I look back on that moment all the time as he was in the position of power. He got what he needed from me. He did not forget it. He recognized me immediately at the first opportunity in a way that really rang home for me. What a great encapsulation.
Oh, that to me is Oh, that to me is perfect. And also, he didn't micromanage you, if I may add to that. He just pointed and he trusted you to know what it was that he was asking you to do and what the final desired result was. And there was not a lot of yeah, or, yeah, 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 yeah,
Yeah,
about
yeah.
what was being asked.
Which of course is something that as a theater company, we had that foundation. We knew what our product was. We knew what we were trying to do. I knew that backdrop had to fly, even if I didn't know exactly what rope to tie off to do it. I knew what his objective was. And that gave me the ability to just follow his direction when he needed me to.
You know what I think is also kind of underlying that whole thing is just as projects, because let's face it, every theater production is a project. It has a start, it has a breakdown day, which a lot of people don't realize. You know, the show doesn't end when the final curtain on the final performance comes down. The
Right.
show ends when we break down all the sets and store all the
Mm-hmm.
costumes. Um, but just like the best project teams, many theater groups become a microcosm of a culture and set of dynamics that either resides on an ongoing building of trust and an ongoing sense of camaraderie, or those little stabs of needles of distrust and manipulation and Machiavellian moves for jockeying for power. And I've always wondered if someone has done any kind of work studying the difference that makes on the final objective, which is a performance that gives our audiences a chance to move away from their day to day. Because what you generate from trust and camaraderie, it's got to be different. We see it in project work all the time.
Right. Right. There's certainly right. There's certainly we having experienced troubled productions and troubled projects. There are certainly similarities, and I think you zoomed in on the important word there, which is trust. There are lots of good models for trust, but I try to keep it simple. I think trust has two main components. If I trust you, I trust that you can, and I trust that you will. And if I can't trust both of those things about you, then it's hard for me to give myself over in the moment to what I need from you. The thing about a production company, theater production company, that I think is a great parallel is there's a core group that is usually together in a company, and then there are other people who come in for that play, that musical, and it's driven by their objective. What show are they putting on? And I think that is a very strong parallel to the way teams are constructed in a corporate product development organization, which is why I've spent most of my career. And it's recognizing that there is a core group and a new group, and every project requires them to come together, which means the importance of blending, the importance of introduction, of the deep and meaningful kickoff to a new project is so important. And of course, it's so often neglected in the rush to begin project work.
Or what one of my not quite favorite bosses used to refer to as the when are you going to start the real work question, that, you know, obviously they like to see us, quote, doing something. And
Yes.
that kind of bypasses all the things that happen inside of, you know, there
Mm-hmm.
that's doing something. Um, when we look at challenges that we can see parallels from, what kind of challenges are you seeing that when you first started out in a professional environment and applying some of these lessons around leadership and dynamics? What are some of the challenges that when you started you'd hoped would be dealt with? We'd grow past it, we'd grow through it, we'd overcome them. But now looking at it, you know, a few years down the road, these challenges are still being um, obstacles for us sometimes, I'll be
Mm-hmm.
honest, and for many, many of our colleagues.
That's a very That's a very interesting question. I think I had a real deep naivete when I started my professional career. And whether it was because I'd spent so many years before in performing arts, developing, you know, that company camaraderie, or all of the, you know, the very bad amateur sports teams I'd been on in my previous life, I tended to give myself a little bit too much over to the whole, and it never occurred to me, or it occurred to me late, that there's a balance between an individual's needs and the team's needs. And I think that despite a great deal of research into that, I think people are still learning that on the job every day.
It's a fine line. And I know that I'm not the only person to use the analogy. As a matter of fact, I think I actually heard you mention it once in casual conversation, the oxygen mask analogy, for those of us who distinctly remember the distant past where we used to fly.
Mm-hmm.
But they always made the point that if you were traveling with anyone that needed assistance putting on their oxygen mask, to put yours on first.
Mm-hmm.
And as leaders, what do you think our responsibility is in terms of making sure that folks take care of themselves in a manner that is healthy without compromising their commitment
Mm-hmm.
to the project that we're asking them to commit to and be a part of?
Yeah, that's a challenge for sure. I think there are two things as leaders we need to be conscious of, and there's always a bit of a balance between how we display them. First, we need to demonstrate an acceptable and appropriate behavior to our teams. And if we're telling people that they need to prioritize their own self-worth, their own health, their own priorities, we need to do the same thing. We're not believable if we say, by all means, you can take Friday off, and then we work 14 hours a day, 6 days a week. So we lose credibility in that exchange. The other thing we need to do is build expectations into their work and our schedules and our communications that acknowledge that people are not available on demand all the time, and let them work around their needs. And it could be as simple as being objective driven instead of effort driven. But it comes down to making room for work and then trusting your team to do the work in the time committed, however they choose to do it.
I think that the past year and a half, gosh, it feels like longer than that, but the past year and a half has been an experience that has taught us the value of objective driven and goal driven assessments of achievement versus how many hours did you put into it. And when it comes right down to it, our paychecks are part of an exchange. They get a paycheck for producing certain deliverables, whether it's reports or new products or, any kind of final deliverable that demonstrates that they have exchanged value for the value they get. You get a paycheck in exchange for doing this.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't about an hourly rate. It's about expertise and application.
Right.
So
we're not producing piece parts on a line. We are responsible for objectives, and that's not to segregate or stratify the work in any way. That's our arrangement. Our arrangement is we have objectives that we will meet, and we have a date upon which they must have been met. And between now and then, it's the team's job to navigate that. I remember very early in my career, I actually canceled a vacation to accommodate an objective. And although at the time there was appreciation and there was support for it, after that event, my vice president sat me down. This is when I was an entry-level engineer. He sat me down and he said, I understand why you did what you did, but you need to understand that you wouldn't give me back a paycheck, so don't give me back your vacation. And he set me off on what he said. That's the frame he gave me. Said, we'll get the work done. you need to take care of yourself too.
Now that person, that's the kind of leader that I truly appreciate.
Mm-hmm.
At one point, my own boss, who was virtual, we were working virtually already in the 80s, said to me, I've made a bargain with Walter, my late husband. She said, I think you've been pushing yourself too hard with the last couple of projects. So if I call you and I ask you to stop for the day, it's fine. There's nothing left on your to-do list, really, is there, that can't wait until tomorrow? We're doing teleconferencing. We're not saving lives here. And if I call back 20 minutes later and you pick up the phone, Walter has my permission to take your chair and roll it out of the office and close the door behind him. And yeah, says the woman who sends emails at 4:00 in the morning. And then she did.
Yeah.
And with great glee, Walter grabbed my office chair and rolled me right out of my office into the living room. And I said, what are you doing? He said, Diana asked me to. That's a great
moment. That's a great moment. I had another boss early in my career when I was assigning a little bit more importance to my work than maybe it deserved. And he just sat me down at the end of the meeting and said very quietly, are you feeling indispensable? And I gave a weak answer. And he said, stay home tomorrow. If we're still open the following day, you're not indispensable.
And I think what's interesting is the point that both of these mentors were making is that there are places where you are absolutely indispensable. Work is not one
of them. That's right. And neither of these men that I just quoted were in any way delinquents. They were not easy on themselves. They were very driven people and great accomplishments to their credits. I emulated their careers in many ways. And both of them were consistent with me on that. And it really flavored, as I became a team leader, it really flavored the way I managed my teams.
Which kind of gets me to the other question that I had mentioned I was interested in. And because of your habit of not stopping at the surface of a thought, but the kind of philosophical ruminations, if you'll pardon the old-fashioned word, but it struck me as very appropriate when it came to how you think about things and how you respond to the thought processes of others. It's a little bit deeper. And I told you about this question because I wanted to get the benefit of that particular habit of yours of really looking at the question. If you were to be able to give the younger you, maybe not at the beginning, maybe just after or more towards the middle, the younger you, one piece of counsel, one piece of advice, what would it be?
I so appreciate the way you phrased that question because it was in the middle of my career that I struggled with it. The beginning of my career, cocky, thinking I was very smart, I came out and I was fully myself in every engagement. And I had a very successful first few years of my career. And then I ran into what all overconfident young engineers run into. I ran into somebody smarter. And when I had that first conflict, I managed it very badly and learned from it, salvaged my career. The engineers with whom I had the conflict and I were great friends for many years after that until their retirements, actually. But I changed myself. I started holding back bits of myself after that because I didn't want to run the risk of having another conflict like that. And so for the second quarter or so of my career, I didn't bring my whole self to my work. So there are things about me that anyone who's known me for any length of time knows. They know that I'm a fanatical New York Mets baseball fan. They know I've played the accordion for 40 years. They know I've published 2 books of poetry. They know I've done the theater that we've already talked about. But I started holding that part of me back, and I was less successful. And I would like to go back to that me, that 7 or 8 years into my career, and say, these are assets you are suppressing. Let them out, because they define you and they can serve you in your work.
Do you think that's a problem that we're seeing with, I feel like I'm hearing my mother come out of my mouth with that next generation who's coming up behind us. And the other day, somebody told me it's not a single next generation, Kimi. You keep miscounting that. And I told them
Yes.
I don't want to think about it. But
Mhm.
do you think that's something that they are going to be struggling with?
I think that I've seen with the earlier career professionals with whom I work, I've seen much more confidence in who they are. And I think part of that is I joined the workforce right after completing my bachelor's degree, and I'm seeing fewer people do that now. I'm seeing more master's degree or PhD professionals. And of course, they're a little more mature. They've invested more time in understanding who they are. And I think that's helpful. On the other side, I think there are more coaches and agencies who are promoting profiles for people and say, there's a career we can get you if you fit this profile. And I find sometimes our first conversation is, stop expecting your next job to fit this puzzle piece you have in your hand. Let's be open to who you are and what you want to learn, because there's a combination out there that serves it. And that combination is what enables the best work.
I think that the puzzle piece analogy is very important, because I know people who start puzzles in the very middle and they expect every single piece to fit. And I know other people who have a rough outline, and then there's a piece there, and maybe a piece there. And
Mm-hmm.
eventually they all connect. It just doesn't happen first off.
Right.
So
Right.
I think that's great. You've been a mentor and a teacher, and in many ways, I've watched you for a number of years now. You've exemplified leadership by striving to be the kind of leader that you would want to follow. And I would like to know how much, since we've talked about the whole you and how leaders need to bring their whole selves,
Mm-hmm.
how much of an impact has being involved in the performing arts and being involved in more literary um, endeavors, how
Mm-hmm.
much of that has informed the level of empathy that you tend to approach your teams with?
I love the word. I love the word empathy. It's a word we don't understand and we don't use often enough. I would say that so many examples I could give, but I'll frame it with 2. I've written 2 books of poetry, and there is nothing more solitary than producing a book, where it's just you and the page, it's you and the word processor. It's all very, 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 insular. But you want people to read that book. Ideally, you want people to buy that book. So it needs to connect with people. And in both of my books, I workshopped, as we say, the contents of the book with live audiences, and in many ways found out what worked before I decided what to include in the books. And then even when I had what I thought was a complete product, I gave it to people to rigorously critique them. So making myself open, collecting feedback at every opportunity, that was essential to the process of producing the book, which ultimately is all me. But even though it's all me, it's got all of these people who contributed. And I think that's one way you learn to identify, first of all, how to ask, and then how to listen, and then to use, with vulnerability, accept feedback and apply it. And that all came out of the experience of the books. And it's still how I approach all my writing today. Another example with a little different twist is I play with an accordion orchestra. And hopefully, as this year comes to an end, we will begin performing together again. But in that experience, I am what I describe myself as a very competent amateur accordionist. I am not a great musician. I'm good. You can give me music and I can sight read it and I can play. But I play with world-class musicians, people who've been recognized by the American Accordionists Association, who performed internationally, and they let me play with them. And in being part of that experience and knowing what I bring, knowing that they trust me to bring something, it forces me to fine-tune who I am. And I have a very different relationship with my accordion orchestra than I do with my teams, than I do with my audience as a poet. But I'm still me. And the thread that connects all of those things is me realizing and recognizing and responding to who people are and what they're looking for from me.
I think that's a very profound point that you just made. Different teams are going to be looking for, and sometimes not realizing that they need different things as you go forward. Your description of yourself as an amateur, and yet I get to play with all these wonderful people. In golf, there's my father was a golfer, and he used to tell me, you don't ever want to play with somebody that you can beat. You want to play with somebody who's going to bring your game up just because of your drive to match their level of skill, their level of talent, their level of discipline. So I always remembered play up. And one of these days, I actually have this secret desire to set up a little performing stage with all of the project management professionals that I know who are also musicians or vocalists, and we'll have a real jam session. Of course, it would probably scare a lot of professional musicians, but I think it would just be so much fun.
I agree.
David, you have been kind enough to be a proponent and to often share some of my thoughts, which is one of the reasons why it was so important that I give a greater audience an opportunity to hear some of your thoughts encapsulated, as opposed to 140 characters going forward. You have a great following on Twitter. At the same time, I just thought there's more to what he's bringing to the table, and there's more to learn from him than you're going to get in 140 characters. So I truly want to thank you for making the time available here and for putting up with a couple of interruptions due to a hardwood estimator. Because of all the people that I have met, you are definitely one of the people that I have found pursues growth in personal and professional levels. And many of us are reaching a point in our time where we're starting to look at maybe taking slightly different directions. And I am looking forward to hearing about what you do and as you go for quite some time to come now. And thank you so much for taking the time.
Well, thank you so much for setting this up and for the very well, thank you so much for setting this up and for the very thoughtful questions and for making it so easy to share some of my stories.
Well, I'm sure I'm not the only one who is delighted to hear them. Ladies and gentlemen, David Vincenti, you'll notice that his Twitter handle is going to be on the closing slide. I would strongly suggest you take a look. Would not surprise me at all if you subscribed. Thanks again, David.
Thank you.